I think the mic's charged up and ready to go this time. It is good to see everyone this evening. Glad that we can be here together. As I mentioned last week, tonight will be our last Sunday night class on the idea of background history. We might revisit some idea of history in kind of a different way later on Sunday nights after a while, but we're going to be transitioning to something different after tonight. So we're going to wrap up what we've been talking about tonight of essentially the Jewish revolt against Rome after Jesus, that Jesus, of course, predicts. We're going to talk about that both in terms of the idea of fulfilled prophecy as well as just kind of understanding the aftermath of all these different things from a historical standpoint. And then after that, I will give y'all a hint, or not a hint, I'll tell y'all what we'll be doing for the next several weeks on Sunday nights. But first of all, I want us to go ahead and be thinking about what we've been talking about for the last few weeks. If you remember, we talked about last time in particular that the idea of the Jews wanting to glorify revolutionaries and feeling like that is the only way they're going to accomplish their goals, that was not something that just happened on the scene in the 60s AD, right before this revolt takes place. This is something that we see, for example, with the release of Barabbas, who most likely was a revolutionary. They released him instead of Jesus because at first they think Jesus is going to be the Messiah they're expecting, who's going to start a physical kingdom and all these things. And when they realize he's not going to be that, well, let's just crucify him and release a revolutionary instead. We see this even before this, of course. We have early on in Jewish history, and when I say early on, I mean from the standpoint of the time of Christ, we have things like the Maccabean revolt and so forth that are kind of ingrained in their mindset. This is how we do this. This is how we accomplish our goals. This is how we get freedom. This is what the kingdom of the Messiah is going to look like. That's hardwired, if you will, into the Jewish mind at this point in time. And that's ultimately the direction that they are choosing to go down. Now, of course, not everyone. There are Jews who listen to the message of Christ and who become Christians, but there are many who shun those people who persist in taking things into their own hands and trying to accomplish their goals through revolution. So we talked, as we wrapped up last week, about a lot of the prophecies that Jesus makes, particularly if you go to Matthew 24, and by the way, we barely scratched the surface of that, right? But you go into Matthew 24, there's so much that Jesus clues his disciples in on as to what's going to happen after him, saying, you don't need to have any part of this. There's going to be, ultimately, a destruction that is coming on the Jewish people because they won't listen to me and they're going to try and do things their own way. Don't get involved. Don't let them suck you into that. Same thing as we've seen that kind of the Hebrews, writer of Hebrews is trying to get people to understand too. Don't get sucked into this. This is a bad idea. Well, let's look at what actually happens as we talk now about the catastrophe as it happens. We talked last time about kind of the seeds of revolt. Now we're going to see the catastrophe of the destruction of Jerusalem come to fruition. So we have Rome, as we talked about, being more and more annoyed, if you will, with the Jews as the Jews become more and more radical. We talked about things like the Sicarii, stabbing people in the backs, and we talked about the growing radicalization of the Jews and the Zealots becoming more and more popular and all those kind of things. So we're talking about a pot that's ready to boil over, right? It's just going to take a little something to cause that to happen. Well, in 66, that happens. The governor at that time, Governor Flores, he decides for whatever reason that he needs more money for his government of this province. And so he decides, I am going to take the money from the Jews. But not just take it from the Jews, that's common enough, right? Tribute. We talked about tax collectors before. They were taking tribute for Rome. But he says, no, I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to send people into the temple, and I'm going to take money from the temple treasury. Now, if you're a Jew, and honestly, even if you were a Jewish Christian, the audacity is pretty profound of someone going into the temple and taking the treasury. Now, from a Christian perspective, of course, that was no longer where the presence of God was, but nonetheless, from a political perspective, this is still a very brash action on the governor's part. Now, why did he get away with it? Well, as I said, the relationship between the Jews and the Romans has been souring ever since Christ. And so, to some extent, Rome kind of, I guess you could say, gave a little bit of free rein to the governors of Judea. Just, listen, treat them however you want, man. They're just getting under our skin at this point, kind of thing. And so the governors had been crueler in the intervening years between Jesus and this event. So it shouldn't really come as a surprise when this happens. But as you might expect, when a Roman governor steals money from the temple in Jerusalem, that's going to cause an issue. And by the way, he also arrested a bunch of Jewish leaders in the process who he suspected of being revolutionaries or something along those lines. So rioting starts happening in Jerusalem. Eventually, that rioting turns into full-fledged revolt. They throw the garrison out, and that revolt spreads beyond Jerusalem, and the whole countryside of Judea ultimately begins to take up arms and try and throw Rome out. Now, we have to remember at this point in time, Rome is a very large empire, and on the one hand, that means they're very wealthy, they're very powerful. But what else happens when you have an empire that stretches really far east and west and north and south? Especially without modern transportation like we think of. You have a lot harder time controlling, especially the far reaches, right, of your empire. Now, far reaches, we're not talking about like all the way to the east or something like that, but still, you think about their methods of transportation, it takes a while to get from Italy to Judea, right? So there's a degree to which the Jews have somewhat of an advantage here, at least initially, as they begin to kick out the garrisons. So they kick a few people out, and I'm summarizing some of this, not up here just because I'm trying to give us a general view. They kick the garrisons out, and the Roman governor in Syria, just north of Judea, he says, okay, I'll take care of this myself. He comes down with a couple of legions, but by this point, there's a lot of supporters of the rebellion, and they managed to drive even those legions back. So they're in full-fledged revolt. This isn't just a, kind of maybe think about the early stages of the American Revolution. What did we want in the very beginning of the American Revolution? Were we going for independence? Anybody know? If you look actually historically, we weren't necessarily trying to become an independent country when we first started the American Revolution. We were actually just trying to resolve some of the issues, like taxation issues and quartering soldiers and those kind of things. We're just trying to get some of those issues resolved because we were claiming that our rights had been violated. And then when the crown rebuffed us, then we said, all right, we're just going to become our own country. But at the very beginning of the revolution, we weren't necessarily going for full-fledged independence. At this point in the revolution where they revolt, they're already there. All right? They're already full on, we want Rome gone. We want to leave them completely gone. We're not going to do terms or treaties or anything like that. We just want to kick them out and them to stay gone. And so we move on then to the kind of early phase of the revolt. Again, remember, it takes time to travel. It takes time for troops to come. It takes time for orders to be given. So they managed to start this revolt. This is actually a coin. If you look at this, you can see some of the writing. Now, it's in Greek, of course, because that was the common language, but you have some of these symbols. This is a coin that was minted by the rebels as part of what they believed would be their new nation, right? They're going to start making their own money. They're not going to use their own money, all these kind of things, because they think they're going to gain their independence. But even though they initially have success driving Rome out, beginning to establish some of their own governments, there are already cracks forming that, as you look back historically, it already was the writing on the wall. Oops, I spoiled the next couple weeks of data. There's already the writing on the wall, right? So, the big part that I want us to notice, and we're going to come back to this, even though they drove the armies back and established a provisional government and all these things, they were already fighting each other. I'm talking like at the very beginning of the revolution. You actually had what amounted to, and I'm going to kind of generalize here, you had basically 3 different factions, give or take, within this Jewish government. And they were already, just in the first year or 2 of this revolt, starting to stage coups against each other, starting to literally kill each other over control of this new government they were trying to establish as the revolution begins in Jerusalem. Now, I'm not saying, just thinking about our own history, I'm not saying that all the founding fathers always got along. In fact, we know they didn't. But I don't know of any of the founding fathers that were stabbing each other in the back within the first year of the revolution, okay? This already doesn't bode well, because what happens if you're already a weak nation, let's just call them that for the sake of, again, generalizing, when you're already a weak nation going up in a revolution against the strongest power in the world, what's the number one thing you need besides recruits? You need unity, right? If you're not unified, you're already at a huge disadvantage. If you're not unified, well, obviously you're not going to win. Well, they weren't. And they really never got unified. None of them liked Rome, but they also didn't like each other. Ultimately, you actually have, what's interesting here, you actually have the provincial government, or provisional government, being established by some of the moderates, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees. And then as the radicals, who kind of kick this whole thing off, start trying to get more and more influence, they actually kick the radicals out, meaning the Sicarii, the guys who are stabbing people in the backs. They're the ones who you would think would be the ringleaders of all this, and they actually get kicked out really early on in the revolution. This entire thing is completely unstable. Now, why do you think the entire thing is completely unstable? What is it about this whole situation already that we can see a problem with? Or maybe let me reword this question. What's the missing piece? After all, haven't there been times where Israel has acted against, revolted against, gone to war against enemy powers and been successful? What's the missing piece here? God. They're doing this on their own. And I want us to see that as a thread throughout all of these events. This is what happens when you try and do the same things that you've done in your past, but the one piece missing is God's not on your side anymore. God's not controlling things. God's not giving the orders. Whenever the judges rose up to save Israel from their oppressors, well, who put the judge in place? God. Who organized the government of Israel? God. Who established the law and who established the things that needed to happen for there to be unity in Israel? God. So once you take God and following him out of the picture, well, it shouldn't be a surprise the Jews are tearing it out each other's throats. And I'm sorry, that's graphic, but that's literally what was happening in the midst of this, because ultimately this is them taking the matter into their own hands and not actually consulting God in any way. So, while all this is going on, they've had some initial success. They've been able to kick the Romans out, but they're already starting to go at each other and try and vie for power in this little upstart government. Meanwhile, Nero, who is emperor at this time, he gives Vespasian 4 legions, and he orders him to stamp out this rebellion. Now, Nero, that's interesting. What do we know about Nero? Just toss some stuff out there. Anything that comes to mind. What do you know about Nero?
He wasn't in his right mind.
Okay, good. Especially the later on he got in life, and we're about 2 to 3 years before the end of his life. So we're right in that stage where he's about to just go way off the deep end mentally. So he's starting to head off the deep end mentally. What else? What else do we know about Nero? Anything else come to mind? Okay. Rome burns and he plays the fiddle. Yes, okay, good. What about Nero's relationship with Christians? Toward the end of his life, now this might be a little after the revolt actually starts, depending on the timelines here, but Nero doesn't exactly like Christians. Particularly, he uses them as a scapegoat when there is that great fire in Rome, and at least in Rome itself, not necessarily through the whole empire, we don't really see an empire-wide persecution, but in Rome itself, he literally, as Raul said, tortures Christians because he's using them as kind of a scapegoat, politically speaking. So if you have Christians who, at this point, are beginning to be seen as different from Jews, but still are understood to have kind of originated from among the Jews, well, what do you think that says for Nero's opinions of the Jews? He's probably not super fond of them either. Now, he's not going to use them as torches for his garden. Yes, that's something he did to Christians. He's not going to use them as torches for his garden in the same way that he would persecute Christians openly, because Jews have some more protections than Christians do under Roman law, but he still probably doesn't like them very much. And then give that, or mix that with the unrest that's been happening over the last few years. So when Nero says, Vespasian, I'm going to give you 4 legions, go in this rebellion, we can understand maybe why he's acting this way. Combination probably of some of his mind going away and paranoia starting to set in, as it often does with people in this kind of position of power, but also this relationship between Rome and the Jews has soured, and in particular probably for Nero, he's not going to put up with this. So they've established their provisional government, but now the legions are coming. And so they sail across the sea under Vespasian, who is a general at this time. They sail across the sea, and the Jews prepare to fight. They are fortifying their cities, they're fortifying their strongholds, they're trying to do everything they can to get everyone ready. And by the way, this would include also recruiting, as we talked about a little bit, especially in Hebrews class and other things. They're continuing this whole time to recruit as much as they can. And they're trying to get as ready as they can be, believing that God's going to be on their side. They're believing that this is going to go down kind of like the Maccabean revolt, where wave after wave of Romans is going to come against them, and every time they're going to be able to drive them back. That's what they're envisioning here. And they're trying to use things like the prophecies in the Old Testament, as well as all these other Jewish scriptures, to convince the people, again, propaganda, as we talked about before, using it as propaganda to convince the people, we're going to win. It's been foretold we're going to win. Well, let's see what happens. Oh, wait, did I skip one? Oh, sorry. So, let's see what happens. Well, ultimately, Vespasian shows up with legions, and piece by piece, everything just falls apart. One by one, the cities are taken. One by one, the strongholds are sieged and razed to the ground. And there's not much quarter given to the Jews who fight either. It's a pretty brutal suppression. When he goes in to stamp out the rebellion on Nero's order, he takes it very seriously. Until, within just a couple years, he has subdued the entire region of Judea except for the city of Jerusalem. So I want us to think about that. How long did the American Revolution last? Anybody know? What was it, 6 years, give or take? 75 to 81, I think? Well, that's a long time. Now, granted, there's more land in America than there is in Israel, right? It's a big difference of land. But I want us to think about, it took them that long to realize they couldn't win, meaning the British, in the American Revolution. It only takes 2 years, if that, for Vespasian to go from landing his forces to everywhere but their capital city is done. Already the Jews are not doing well, but they're still clinging to hope, not only because of all this propaganda, but just as Vespasian's about to attack Jerusalem, Nero dies. Now, what happens, do you think, when an emperor dies? Usually, there's a successor that's been put in place. So why doesn't that happen? Well, because Nero never established a successor. He doesn't have a child that he can pass on the empire to, and he hasn't established anyone who would be appointed as his successor. So all of a sudden, everyone in Rome says, you know, Emperor Neil Sidoff sounds really, really good to me, right? They all start getting nice, big, imperial ideas, and ultimately, Vespasian leaves because he's one of the ones that starts getting those ideas. And you have, for about a year, this crazy fight in Rome. We talked about this a little bit in Revelation. You have this crazy fight in Rome where 4 men, essentially, one right after the other, in the space of just a few months, one by one, put themselves in the position of emperor, only to be ousted and replaced by the next guy, only to be ousted and replaced by the next guy. Now, Vespasian was smart. All the other ones just kind of tried to do this on their own. Vespasian, if I understand correctly, he took his troops and he got a stranglehold, if you will, on the area of Egypt, the province of Egypt. So while all of this is going on in Rome, Vespasian controls Egypt. Now, why is Egypt important? Anybody know why Egypt was important to the Roman Empire? What is Egypt known for? I'll throw the pyramids out. That's not the one I'm looking for. Anybody know what comes to mind when you think of Egypt? Do what? Okay, good. The city of Alexandria. Do what? Okay, there were some gold mines. What's the big feature of Egypt in terms of the Nile River? Why was the Nile River important? Well, if you know anything about ancient food growing practices, agricultural practices, it's kind of hard to irrigate using ancient tools. But it can be a whole lot easier if you have a really big river that floods consistently every season or every year in its season, which means essentially you can construct irrigation to where you know you're going to have water all along the riverbed that will be able to water your crops. Bottom line is, by this point in time in the Roman Empire, Egypt is the breadbasket. Egypt is where the majority of the food comes from for the empire. That's the big food producer. So by instead of going to Rome, going to Egypt, what's Vespasian just done? He said, yeah, you better make me emperor if you want to eat. All the other ones just said, hey, I'll go to Rome and I'll put the crown on my head. Here we go. Vespasian says, I have a better idea. I'll give you food. And the people went for it. And so at the end of that time, the Jews got this short little break. But at the end of the year, Vespasian is the one who becomes emperor. Now, if Vespasian becomes emperor and he is the one who just crushed the Jewish rebellion everywhere but Jerusalem, what do you think Vespasian's first order of business is going to be? Well, it's not going to look very good as a new emperor if he doesn't finish what he started in expanding the glory of Rome. So his first job is to send Titus, his son, as the general to replace him, and he's going to finish what he started. He's going to crush the rebels in Jerusalem. So Titus is sent there. Of course, the legions have still kind of been in place to some extent, or at least a garrison enough to keep the Jews under control while Vespasian was gone. So Titus is sent back in with troops, and now he's going to resolve this conflict once and for all. So now we have what seems like this big showdown, right? We have Titus with these Roman legions outside the walls of Jerusalem. But remember, Jerusalem is no small city. And Jerusalem's fortifications for the ancient world were top-notch. They are some of the best. This is one of the best places to defend in the ancient world, I would argue, certainly in the East. So this seems like it's going to be a really tough fight. And there are a lot of Jews who have flocked to Jerusalem in order to participate in this fight and defend their holy city. But remember what we talked about? Jews fighting Jews, going at each other, trying to take power, trying to oust control or oust the ones that are in power. That doesn't even stop when Jerusalem goes under siege. In fact, even during the Roman siege, you have different factions within the Jewish government literally barricading themselves in one instance, even the temple, because the others would kill them if they came out. The Sicarii, if I'm remembering correctly, I remember this happened. I think it was the Sicarii who did it. Even at one point, in the midst of all this infighting, burned the food supplies of the city while they're under siege. Now, what's the quickest way to beat someone who's under siege? Well, you starve them out. Well, they just said, hey, Romans, you want a Christmas present? Right? We'll burn our own food for you. It was ridiculous. So because of not only the Romans and everything they do, but especially because of the Jewish infighting, you have an absolutely brutal siege. The Romans, very strategically, they allowed a lot of civilians to enter the city. You know, if you have a siege, right, you make a camp all the way around the city so people can't get out. But the Romans, they had a good idea. They let people come in because guess what happens if you send more people into a besieged city? Yeah, maybe there's more soldiers, but what else do you have more of? More mouths to feed, which means the food doesn't go as far, which means more starvation. They would never let anybody out, the Romans wouldn't, but they'd let anyone in who wanted to go in because then they just starve faster. And so all these civilians are flocking to Jerusalem for protection when really they're just going there to die, even though they don't realize it. It was a particularly brutal siege. In fact, according to Josephus and some of those who recorded it, one of the most brutal that's ever been seen in at least history up to that time. Now, of course, we could look back historically and say, okay, maybe that's needs some qualifiers, but there are even records, and we've seen this in other times where God punished the Jews in the Old Testament, if you remember. There are even records of people eating their own children during this siege. That's how bad it got. Ultimately, it shouldn't be a surprise how this ends. Piece by piece, Titus pushed the Jews back, first from the outer wall, then from the next wall, finally pushing them all the way to the fortifications right outside the temple. And eventually, as those walls themselves are breached, we're not exactly sure how it happened, and it seems like Titus might have tried to stop it, but nonetheless, torches were thrown into the temple, and the temple itself was burned down. And some of the artifacts they managed to loot before it burned completely down, as we even see, if you remember, or not if you remember, if you've ever seen, this is a picture on the Arch of Triumph, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. That monument was erected in commemoration of Titus' victories. And in part, we see this depiction of a menorah from the siege of Jerusalem. So ultimately, they lose. That's the bottom line. Just like Jesus said they would, just like he predicted 40 years beforehand, they're no match for the Romans, not because God couldn't protect them, because God had removed his protection. Because they weren't fighting for him anymore. They were trying to fight for the kingdom they wanted, not the kingdom that God had always had in mind. And all that propaganda, using the Old Testament prophets and all these other Jewish writings to say God is on our side, all of it just was proven to be false. If you think about, for example, the predictions that have come about in the last 100, 200 years of when Christ is coming back, people always, he's coming back on this date in 1859, he's coming back on this date in 1921, right? That's happened so many times in the last couple hundred years. I mean, several hundred years before that even, but we're familiar with it even in America. What happens every time that day comes and Christ doesn't? Well, you just look dumb, right? If you're the one who predicted it. I want us to think in those terms of all these Jews who were claiming God had guaranteed victory. Because what they got was complete defeat. Ultimately, there would be even another revolt about 30 to 50 years later, and the city of Jerusalem would essentially be converted into a Gentile city with a statue of Zeus right in the middle of it. They failed. They failed completely. And it's interesting to note, although I don't want to chase this rabbit tonight, that failure actually resulted in the Jews essentially blaming God. And that's ultimately the seeds of what we now call Gnosticism, it seems. Because what they did is they took all these predictions and then said, wait a minute, if these didn't come true like we thought they would, maybe our conception of God is actually corrupt and there's a higher God above our God and blah, blah. And that's where you have this whole weird system of kind of partial deities that you have in Gnosticism and everything that goes along with that. Again, not going to chase that rabbit tonight. That's a whole other discussion. The bottom line, as we look at this, is that Jesus' predictions came true. Back to Matthew 24. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will be gathered together. Some translations say eagles, which would also work, because the standard of Rome was an eagle. Interesting that Rome and America both have eagles as national symbols. But anyway, we have Jesus' predictions coming true here. This isn't going to end in any way but death for all those who try and build a kingdom on their own. Just like we talked about, I believe it was last week, whenever Israel was going to go in the promised land and then the 12 spies come back and the 10 say, no, we can't do this, and they're scared. And then God says, well, you won't go for 40 years. And they say, oh, never mind, we'll do it ourselves. And it doesn't work. We should be thinking of the same thing here. They try and do their own thing, go against God's wishes, and it doesn't work. It fails spectacularly. So when they try to take matters in their own hands, establish an earthly kingdom, it was doomed from the start. That's why Jesus said, don't even get involved. Run. When you see Rome coming, when you see the legions approaching, when you see all these events coming, get out. Because it's not going to do you any good to stick around and fight for a cause that's already lost. Because God's not fighting for the cause. We looked at Daniel, right? How many of Daniel and his friends' causes looked like lost causes? Pretty much all of them. But God was with them, so they weren't lost causes. But even when something doesn't look like a lost cause to us, if God's not on the side of those fighting for the cause, it's doomed from the start. Any questions or comments before we wrap up for tonight and for this class in general?
Didn't this actually help disperse the Christians to make them spread all over?
Okay, good. Yes, so we have ultimately the persecution from the Jews causes kind of an initial spread, but then when they take Jesus' advice and scatter because the Romans are coming, yes, you do have a further spreading of the gospel because the Christians are spread out during this revolt because Jesus told them not to be part of it. Very good observation. So again, through providence, we have not only the destruction of the Jews for taking matters in their own hands in this case, but also the furtherance of the kingdom because Jesus told his followers what to expect. Very good point. Anything else? All right. I won't take up much of your time, but I do want to tell you what's coming next week. We're going to be going through a book. We're going to be going through a book called Tactics. Now, I understand this is not a book of the Bible, but this is a book applying principles from the Bible in a very practical way that I think will be very helpful to us. The idea is when we have conversations with people, anyone, friends, family, or even someone who comes up to you on the street is like, hey, I'm an atheist and you're a Christian, so you're an idiot because I know what I'm talking about. How do we handle that? How do we talk to people? On any level, whether it's we have a few disagreements with them, or whether it's they just don't believe in God, hate anyone who does, any level on that spectrum, from extreme to just very pleasant conversation but disagreement, how do we talk to them? There are a lot of very, very helpful practical principles in this book of having those kind of discussions. And I'll tell you right now, I wish I had read this book 20 years ago. Because there are so many things in this book. I know you're saying 20 years. 20 years ago, I was really into apologetics. Okay, I love reading stuff about apologetics and proving God's existence and all that kind of stuff. And I never came across anything as helpful as this in terms of the actual conversations. Basically, what it does, and I won't go into too much detail because we'll talk about it next week and the following weeks. Basically, what it does is it takes Jesus' own approach to interacting with people, and it makes it kind of puts it in practical terms so that we can just have a few tools at our fingertips to be able to have more effective conversations about God, about Scripture, about our beliefs with others. So this is something that I've really enjoyed reading through, and really, really thankful that I was clued into it by a friend at camp this past camp session, and I'm really, really excited for us to look at. So I say all that to say, if you want to get a copy of this book and read it for yourselves, I very much encourage that. We're going to be going through the book and pulling principles from it. We're not going to read it word for word or anything in class. But if you want your own copy of it, feel free. You can, if you want to take a picture of this real quick on the screen, or if you want me to send you something or show you a copy of the book, I'd be happy to do that, and you can get one yourself. But either way, this is what we're going to be going through starting not next Sunday night, but the Sunday night after that, since next Sunday is our meal. So I'm really, really excited about this, really looking forward to going through this. I think it'll be very helpful just on an extremely practical, tangible level for us as we're trying to share our faith. I thank you all so much for your attention tonight. And as always, the Lord's invitation is open. If there's any way we can help you out, please let us know as we stand and sing together.
What can wash away
My sin, nothing but the blood of Jesus.